Just to say welcome to everybody. Thanks very much for coming along to our leadership webinar series. We're featuring Lee Williams today from Central Academies Trust. I'm very happy to welcome him. The slot is being recorded, and I imagine that a lot of people will be listening to the recording, and we're in quite a busy week, aren't we, the week before half term. So thanks to those of you who have come along and made the time. We were just saying earlier, Lee and I, how fantastic it is to be able to hear from some professionals in our city and to share good practice and have those wonderful discussions. And this one sounds really interesting today, to unlock the power of strategic leadership. So welcome. I'm very glad you're here with us, and I'm going to hand over to Lee to start our webinar. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks very much, Julia, and welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to be presenting this afternoon, and I hope that the journey, as what I would call this webinar, is useful, and there are bits that you can take from it to use in your own settings. I think that just before moving into the outline of the programme, lots of the information that I want to share, and also to encourage as much discussion today, is based on what's strategically been learnt and experienced through my work with Central Academies Trust, and in predominantly through the times of being the principal at Lords of Boys School in Birmingham, which is a secondary school, year 7 to 11. I think that there's also a couple of bits that I'll probably keep referring back to through this webinar. One of them is being conscious of needing to accept when things need to change, but also to be bold enough to not change things for change's sake either. And then one of my key learns over the last probably 12 months now, as my position has changed slightly, has been to ensure that you just own your mistakes, because mistakes are a great thing to learn by. So as much discussion as possible today, and I know that we've got the question and answer function operational. So if a question pops up in your mind, please feel free to add it into that question and answer function that you'll find in your settings, whatever device you're using, and I'll get round to them when I can. If you've got a question that you'd like to, or a point that you'd like to open up a discussion about, again, please make yourself known, and we'll get to that too. So the programme that I'm going to try and stick to as broadly as possible, broken into 5 different subcategories. We've got some planned breakout activities that might turn into just more wider open discussion activities this afternoon as well, just for the benefit of keeping that open and transparent for recording purposes too. There's a short break schedule, but we'll gauge the temperature of the room as to whether we need to or feel that there's a need for that at the time, and then at the final points, just any closing remarks and Q&As. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background of who I am. So I'm currently the interim CEO and executive head teacher for Central Academies Trust and Lords of Boys School. Father of three healthy, happy young girls who turn my hair grey by the minute, but what would life be without a bit of grey hair? A husband, a teacher of 20 years, and I feel absolutely privileged to have worked in our city for those 20 years as well, and I've learned and experienced many times of passion, challenge, and success in those 20 years as well. A senior leader for 14 of those 20 years, and the principal at Lords of Boys School for 7 of those 14 years, And there'll be moments today where I do think it's important to talk about context, because context is what shapes us, but it's also what shapes our thinking as strategic practitioners too. And so I am going to, I suppose, naturally pull on those experiences of the 7 years of strategic leadership here, and kind of paint a picture of the story of how strategic planning and that school development plan document, as it's often called, has been influential in making sure what we dreamed of became or came to pass. So I've been the interim CEO, executive head teacher for 5 months, started in January the 1st, and that's been a really different set of challenges and levels of understanding to get through and to work through, and that, I suppose, comes with lots of change in all of our different experiences. But the change from leading a school to leading a trust is a big one. I'm not going to talk about that today. There's no reference to that in this webinar either. I'm focused purely on your school leadership priorities and the focus points. I'm a huge Villa fan. Make no apology for it, and we've got a lot to celebrate at the moment as well. I'm a keen sportsman, but absolutely love nothing more than being at Villa Park and enjoying those moments with my one daughter, who I would say is actually a bigger Villa fan than what I am at the moment. Thanks, Juliet. Love that. I know that that might be controversial. Please don't tune out if you're not a Villa fan, or even furthermore if you're a Blues fan. I'm a primary school governor. And in the last 3 years, I've been working as a secondary school improvement partner with schools that are actually outside of Birmingham, which has been really insightful and very, very useful to get an understanding of what different localities prioritise and how school improvement can transfer across the country as well. I've just completed an NPQ EL in preparation for readying for the CEO role. If there are delegates on the webinar today and watching that have been through the NPQ programme, I hope your experience has been as insightful and useful as mine has been. The programme, I think, really does give you lots to think about, and more so than anything is something that is deeply rooted in evidence-based strategy and learning too. And then the final bullet point, I am an ENTJA, and there might be people that look at those letters and go, yeah, I know what that is. If you don't, stay tuned, because this forms part of the detail that I want to explore with you in terms of how you strategize and how you plan for the things that you want to do or that you know need to be done in your schools. So an ENTJA. So let's just talk about, I was carrying on my introduction and talk about the school improvement journey and the way that the school development planning journey has enabled the success at Lords of Boys School. And I think there are lots of parallels that can be drawn from not only the secondary into primary, but primary into secondary. And I'm aware that we'll have an eclectic mix of different school leaders tuning in today or watching on the web on the recording as well. When we talk about school improvement, I often refer to the analogy of climbing a mountain, and what better mountain to use than Mount Everest. And this concept of starting at base camp, moving up a little bit, acclimatising to the reduction of oxygen levels, then moving back down to base camp to do some reflection and to do some rethinking and planning of where you need to maybe navigate around some of the more trickier territory. I know it's an analogy that's used far and wide across the world, but it's the journey at Lordswood Boys School and my leadership journey, I would say, has definitely felt like an expedition to climb one of the highest peaks. I think you constantly reflect as a leader as to, well, am I at the summit yet? And I think the analogy maybe goes a little bit further, doesn't it? In that there are the summit is what you want the summit to be at that time and at that milestone. Being content with being at any summit, I would suggest requires some then deeper thought as to, well, where else do you want to go? The reason why I think it's important that we as leaders operate in that capacity is because of the people that we serve, the children in the first instance, and then the stakeholders that rely on our expertise and our strategies to provide a quality public service that aligns with those principles that we should continue to maintain, the Nolan principles in particular. So the journey for me as the principal here was to be the principal at a school that had got all of those factors up against it: a falling role in the city, an inherited deficit, some of the lowest outcomes that a school nationally was being recognised as. A critical and horrendous persistent absence rate, and some real dysfunctionality in leadership and staff. And these are matters that we have to be bold to address, but we have to be transparent in discussing too, because these are factors that strategy and school development planning will often need to challenge and address quite quickly. One of the biggest things that we recognise, and this is quite critical to this webinar as well, one of the biggest things that we recognised here at Lordswood Boys School, this will be a theme that runs throughout quite a lot of the content that I talked to you about this afternoon, is that students really struggle to read. And this here just presents an initial analysis of our data gathering on reading ages versus chronological ages. And so what you can see labelled at the top is a cage, cage per month, which is the chronological age per month of a student, versus the reading age or the rage of a student, and you can see that date goes back to 2017. So on average, the students here were reading 44 months behind their chronological age. That's 3.5 years. And when you pin that to the lowest national performance indicators, which were at the time, you marry those two up quite quickly, because students were sitting examinations that they weren't able to access the scripts. So you can see the graph shows age in months increasing, and then how far above or below what you would expect a student to be at that age, and that downward trajectory. So that formed a real focal points. This is significant because this is something that has lasted and continued to be a refocused summit point, to use that analogy from the Everest slide, that we've gone back to year on year out, which you'll get to see in a moment. The net outcome of focusing on this has been the success of the school over the last 4 years where accountability measures have been used, but a little bit longer if you count the COVID the COVID era as well. So there's continued growing student numbers with absolute health in that, and equally health in year admissions as well, which has been great to be able to support the locality, but the local authority as well with those student placements. A student number that's at PAN for the first time for September this year. Some significant steps forward in the community trusting as our environment, and then some really healthy primary school links. But without challenging and tackling this, which was the pandemic that we were in, you don't get to these details without that. The continued success of that was that in February 22, the school was inspected. It had not been previously inspected under the Section 5 Education Acts since it has academised into Central Academies Trust. It was found to be good in all areas, which was superb. And it was never before above requiring improvement in the modern era of inspections at the school. The literacy programme has transformed the school, but it has been enabled by the school development planning. And that's where we'll, in a moment or two, get to the nub of the experiences of this school development plan and school improvement journey. We coined a phrase when we started this back in 2018, and the coined phrase, as simple as it is, can be interpreted however you want. But the community understood this, and the phrase was, get them in and get them reading, because attendance was shocking and students didn't enjoy coming to school, because if they did, they'd have been here. But they weren't, and persistent absence was a problem. And they couldn't read. So we needed to get them in and get them reading. And that was the key driver and focus. And that's how our school development plan was born. We're now in a position where reading is just done all of the time. We have a publishing house in school where young authors publish texts via journals or blogs, or publish books of their own. We've got at least a student in every year at the moment that has published a book that's you can purchase via Amazon Bookshop, which is significant and encouraging, and evidences the focus and attention and resource that's been put into this part of the strategy, because it hasn't all just been about literacy. And we commit to this statement now, which is as bold as brass on the drive as you drive into the school, that in the school we read more, because the more that we read, and recognising the label that boys are given as reluctant readers, we think it's really important to tip that trend and be unique in the way that is addressed, and a bold statement is only as good as it being lived out in the environment of your school. So that's context and information, just as a kind of a bit of a snapshot as to where Lordswood has been, and how that journey has looked in a very short space of time. I appreciate. So I just wanted to, we'll move into the main part of the sessions now. I think from the literature that's been circulated based on this webinar, the key points of and objectives are outlined in that detail. Looking at how strategic frameworks can be formed, the critical stakeholder engagement and how effective that can be. The importance of using data and using data at every point, but making sure that you're using the right data. And I hope that from the rest of this session this afternoon, you get you get some insights into the way that not only we've used data, but some thinking time as well, whilst you're listening to different concepts and ideas that have come to pass, of how that data usage in your own settings can be used either differently, effectively, or go even further. The inclusivity of leadership. You can't do this stuff on your own. We know that. So it's important that there are those partnerships, and they're developed within your contexts. And then the resource optimization and looking at, what are our regularities and what do we work towards, which we understand the concepts of the inspectorate, and then also the way the partnerships that I suppose we work within in an evolving maths sector as well. But then again, in working in partnership with local partners such as BEP and the local authority in their different ways. So people make places. Without having properly considered and understood this in the onset, I don't think we would have been, or I don't think you can be as successful as you would dream to be. So let me just explore this, and here I'm coming back to the who I am slide, because in the who I am slide, I said to you that I am an ENTJA, and what that means is, it means that I understand who I am from a personality and psychometric perspective. There's two questions that I'd like you to just think about here, and feel free to raise your hand if you want to say anything about this at this moment in time as well. But how well do you know your people? And I used to think as a colleague that had worked at the school before becoming the principal, I thought I knew our people well, and I did. I knew them well. I knew much about them all individually. This was a small setting back then. There were no more than 25 teachers, and I knew them. I knew bits about their life, but what I soon came to realise as I worked through this personality and psychometric work was that I didn't really know everything that I needed to know about them to lever or to pull the right levers to support them in being next to me and by my side whilst we were conceiving, developing and putting into practice a development plan. The second question is, how well do you know yourself? Because I think everybody would say that you know yourself pretty well. But when you come to the perspective of, well, how do you analyze what you know yourself to be as a leader? Where are your skill sets best utilized? What boundaries do you have to work to as a leader? What provides you the best optimal conditions to deliver what you need to deliver to make the students' experience as good as possible. So following on from that, we embarked on an initial project of looking at using the 16 personalities psychometric analysis details. I know that there are, and I think I just saw a chat something in the chat come up about the Myers-Briggs, which are their parallel practices or analysis tools. So we start to look at, well, how do our leaders fit into and who are they? So the 16 personalities test categorizes people into 4 component parts. You're either an analyst, a diplomat, a sentinel, or an explorer. And all of these personality traits within our working lives and personal lives to a certain degree are classified with specific qualities, specific weaknesses too, because it's important that you're able to focus on what your strengths are as well as your weaknesses, because that's what makes us better, right? And so, as you can start to see there, you know, my classification has been an ENTJA. I'm classified as a commander, somebody that's bold, imaginative, and strong-willed, always finding a way or making one. And that's good to know. It's even better to be able to know it about your team, and then start to form your strategies based on who you know you have by your side. Because there isn't, I don't think, and that's a personal opinion, I don't think there is, there's no right or wrong way to manage this type of practice. But if you know, that puts you in a stronger, more beneficial position to utilise that. So this next slide here just gives you a taste of the way that we started to use this, obviously anonymized, apart from the one at the beginning, which is me. I have no problem with sharing those details with you. Those personality psychometric analysis tests just allude to lots of different things. Some of those metrics that are measured there are neither here nor there, really. When you look at the categories of energy down to identity, but it is quite important when you consider the roles that people will naturally take on. So the role of an analyst or the role of a diplomat, and then the strategies that people will naturally take on. So these two categories here, role and strategy, they're the classified details of what that person will naturally take on. And I appreciate that there'll be colleagues on the call now and also watching this that will be familiar with details like this. I just wanted to pin it to the relevance of how it informs our initial strategy thinking when conceiving what needed to be a very, very specific set of actions to recover a school and rescue the educational outcomes of many students to come too. So I think the point here that I'm really getting at, and to use the sporting analogy maybe here, is that you wouldn't run a marathon without doing the appropriate amount of training and conditioning. Understanding the route and the terrain of what you're going to be up against, and then being clear as to where your food and drink stops are. And I think the link to what we're talking about here is obviously much more important. Well, depending on what your profession is, if you're a marathon runner, then it's in the opposite direction. But really understanding where your team factors in the details, the profiles, the skill sets, the partnerships that can be formed, the support that people will need along the way, the development, and coming back to this word about the boundaries. This is for me, and this has clarified itself even further over the last 7 years, as being about the optimum working conditions, whatever that condition might be, the condition that we make sure that any meeting has an agenda, and the agenda, any items that are to be discussed on the agenda, have been circulated at least 48 hours before, because knowing some people can't come into meetings and be given a piece of paper with a list of things on and be able to digest it immediately to give their most and best input into that meeting. That's a very simple example, I suppose, of the boundaries that I'm talking about here. but knowing those profiles are a really insightful piece of work as well. So, moving on, session one, or section one of this. Let's take a look at some definitions, some components, some examples, and then maybe touch on some of the national educational policy and settings. So, bringing the SDP to its simplest form. Just a very short statement there. But there's one word in particular that I do want to pull on. And yes, we do want our development plans to be clear and simple, and to focus on those main priorities, measure it, test it, evidence it, and ensure that the outcomes and targets are achievable and then achieved as well. But the key thing, the key word, one word, it is in bold and underlined, although there are others as well. It is the word simple. And I'll go a little bit further and explain the word simple for me means typically, and this will, I think, become clear throughout the webinar as well, typically refers to the rule of three. Keep things simple and keep things to the rule of three as far as you can. Because when people work to three clear things, they typically become more achievable. Evidence supports this from our experience as a species, but also, interestingly, the rule of three is just everywhere around us as well. So here are a few examples, and just to really hone in on this point about simplicity, the rule of three. The rule of three is in lots of stories that we read. Three Little Pigs. The rule of three is you can be seen within a lot of our history. An example: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rule of three is seen within physics, Newton's three laws. It can be seen within writing, the three acts of plays, slogans, snap, crackle, and pop. Or if you can remember that, I'm sure you all can. Or just do it, Nike. Photography, rule of thirds, and consultancy. And I think, we draw back to maybe education in our sector here. The three key things. What are the three key things that your organisation has the capacity to focus on and actually see beneficial results and outcomes from it too? So moving that on a little bit further, and I'm sure that this illustration becomes or is very familiar with you all. Just while I'm talking about this, anybody that has got any experience, or even you're familiar with it, you've used it, if you can just put maybe a thumbs up in the chat, or maybe even a very brief example of how you have used it in the past. But for those of you that haven't, this is the EEF implementation guide strategy document, which has been in place for a good few years now, and is a pivotal part of learning in any of and all of, I think, the MPQ programs too. Yeah, thank you for that, Sophie. It is a great tool because it really starts to qualify and quantify the journey of improving things, right? Because without a cycle that starts in an exploratory phase to come to a delivery point and sustainability, there are typically going to be holes left along the way. There is a key and quite important parts of this, and we've used it throughout every year that we have developed and evolved our SDP at Lordswood as well, because it's allowed us to go back to an evidence-based and highly effective, in my opinion. I know that there are different opinions about this implementation guide. But there's this one key factor that happens in the prepare stage for me, which is the not ready, adapt your plan, or ready, carry on. And this comes back to the point that I was making, I think, towards the start of the webinar, which was be bold in what you do and what you dream for, but own those things that aren't going quite in the direction or aren't quite right at the time either, because it's fine. It's absolutely fine as leaders to be able to say that's not right at this moment in time. Try your best where you can to quantify the reason why you're making that decision. It's not ready because of. We were trying to be really ambitious in the early stages of our development at the school. We wanted what we call now an elite sports academy, and we put it into our first draft SDP for year 1. And very quickly, when we got through the final exploration stages and the preparation stages, we had to say that's not right now. We can't do that. We don't have X, Y, and Z, and the X, Y, and Z were we don't have the resource, we don't have the money, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the knowledge of how to do that. So we had to go out and find it. So it's a vehicle and an operation process that will get you to a point of really burrowing into what do you want to achieve and how are you going to achieve it. So we use this tool frequently, but we don't only use it for school development planning. We use it for the implementation of anything that we want to do. Colleagues have just been using it this half term because we want to make a subtle change to the uniform at the school. But we've used this tool to ensure that the steps along the way, uniform, okay, well, uniform is, in my opinion, one of the biggest parts about school because it's identity. Your identity is critical. Students and stakeholders buy into that. It's who they are. It's the recognition that your kids have when they're in the community as well. But we use it for even the simplest of things. You know, we wanted to change the tie of the school because of the college development, the house developments in the school. So that's been a real fundamental and useful tool to be using. The other concept, and this next slide will go on to a suggested text to read, or it's actually a book, which I've dropped a couple into this presentation to hopefully help steer and enrich some of the concepts and points I'm making. But the next part that we tackled in the very, very early stages of developing what we consider to be a highly successful and effective CPD, but also the architecture that's lasted the test of time over the last 5 years as well, is to be really clear with leaders and also the school staff about the difference between the complex and the complicated. Because the early thinking of our development planning had to differentiate between these two issues, because we were talking about some highly complex problems, some of them and those complex problems being qualified by the unknown factors within the details of what we were working with, but also uncovering with finding out different bits of details about the school. And then being more specifically focused on the complicated problems. And I would consider that I would state with confidence now that in the early days, the school and the environment and the context was a completely complicated one, because there weren't any rules and there weren't any recipes to the way that the school needed to improve. Just noticed a Q&A, a question coming into the question and answer box. I'm not sure who that's come from. At the end of this session, which is there's about 4 or 5 other slides, I'll come back to that question for you. And try and answer that in a little bit more detail as well, because I'll wrap up this first session at that point. So the complicated factors became much less complicated within 12 months. In fact, within 3 weeks, when there was a clear set of rules. I'm calling them rules as a generic term. It's a set. There are a set of conditions that were born out of the strategy and the composition of the school development plan, and then the recipes, the component parts to detangle that complicated mess. Some of the complex things, even still today, some of the complex things we can't affect because they are things that are out of our hands. Complex factors that surround families sometimes, complex factors that surround the issues that are dealt with at department level. So it was really important to separate those out and control what could be controlled, and the controllable factors typically are the complicated ones, because you can, once you're outlined and understand what your complicated factors are, it's like putting up a set of coat hooks. You can tidy your cupboard up, you can hang your coats on, because you can pin things to those complicated factors. Is there a problem? What's the problem? How can we pin it back to so it doesn't become complicated and even more complicated as well? The book that I'd like to just recommend is this one. It's Not Complicated. This focuses on business, but a lot of the detail within it is transferable, as you would expect. That paradigm shift into making things more simple, and this maybe comes back to this point that I was making about the simplicity and the rule of three. And I think just kind of looking at that question as it's come up as well, the rule of three concept will become, I think, clearer as we move through the next few slides as well, the webinar. So there's your first suggested bit of reading. Not a massive book either. Quite a comfortable one to read. So the school development plans, and these are the last 4 years of school development plans at our school. The title at the top here is to co-construct lasting systems, because a development plan should, or its concepts, its format, its intent statements, that key word, it should, when co-constructed and thought deeply about, it should last or outlive people. That was the conceptual thinking here, was create a program, create a document, create whatever it is. They're pieces of paper at the end of the day with words on them, but create a vision that people become familiar with, because it stays the same or very similar, and they understand what your priority engagement points are. And this is where we come to the rule of three here, because none of our school development plans have ever had anything more than 3 priority targets within them, because that's what has been manageable and achievable within those phases of school development and school improvement. So you can see here 4 examples just flitting through the screen. Not that you'll be able to necessarily read any of the details, and I'll go into some of that in a moment as we move through the slides too. But these were evolutionary states of school development planning, of thinking and strategy. They were formed in total collaboration. This was not me sat on a computer working out what strategy needed to be adopted and then actioned. This was multi-layered, collaborative, and every step of the way informing the SDP. And one might say that this is a really good time of the year to be talking about this again, because this was the time of the year, and typically is the time of the year, where we really get into the throes of finalising our school development plans for the following year. Every one of these documents that you can see flashing in front of you at the moment has been adapted at some point in year, and it's a really important part and factor of a development plan document that you are comfortable and confident and bold enough to be able to go back into it and change something or add something in because of a lesson that you've learned, as because of a target that you've set yourself or the organisation is setting in collaboration for the betterment of the student experience. And so these documents are truly, or have truly been, what we consider and call live documents. They've lived with the organisation as they have been used day by day, and people use them in very different ways. And this is where we come back to the 16 personalities. Some people in the school, some leaders in particular, have used them as a tick list. Have I done that? Yes, I've done that. Where's the evidence? Here's the evidence. It's in a folder, or it's there. It's an anecdote. It's a conversation. It's a video, whatever. Some people use them as a checklist, a tick list. Some people use them as a check-in at line management, because out of all of these planning materials, you derive appraisal conversations, right? Because when a system that's co-constructed and set to last over a 12-month period and then beyond in terms of its format, works successfully when there is complete ownership. So using those formats and forums to encourage frequent engagement and interaction. The SDP, I ask that the SDP is present in every office or workroom in the school. I'll come back to that quite later on in the presentation as well. And I want to link to something that I heard one of the speakers at the BEP conference 2 years ago say about these concepts as well. So we'll pin that at a moment. So this is the concept of laminated ideas on a wall. Okay, let's try and remember that, and I'll bring it back in one of the slides at the end of towards the end of the presentation. So they were live, and any changes that were made, they were communicated immediately. And the organisation, because it was in a co-constructed fashion, the organisation knew that there would be potentially changes along the way, and so therefore, when those changes came, we'd communicate it. So let's get rid of those flashing things off the screen for a bit and get into a little bit more detail to what they meant. So here's the qualifying factor of the rule of three. What can an organisation manage, sustain, and act upon within a period of time? And period of time that we're setting for an SDP is 12 months. And we focused on three things: literacy, engagement, and then outcomes. The literacy part, I think, spoken in detail about that. It was something that really did need to be looked at, because kids couldn't read, and so therefore they couldn't do much else. They were struggling to speak to their teacher and others because they weren't able to develop that oracy, and also they weren't in school, and so we had to prioritize that engagement factor, and we set some really challenging targets in the first instance. But here is a real, I think, just a pinned point about co-constructed systems and architecture that lasts within an organisation's understanding and commitment. So priority 2 was engagement, and it was really focused on attendance and behaviours, or what you would say, attitudes and behaviours. And attendance is a problem at the moment. We know that nationally, but we're really proud to be able to say that attendance at the school continues to be not only way above what was the national average pre-COVID, the 94.8%, and I appreciate here that I'm talking from a secondary perspective there. There are some slight differences between the two phases. But when those systems are set well and embedded and understood, and they're able to bridge the gap of people within an organisation that maybe leave and people within an organisation that come into the organisation, there's a transparency and full understanding of it. And just today alone, to be able to say that the school attendance here at this school in Birmingham, when there is a real issue with attendance, and it's not always like this, but it is pretty consistently high, is 97.1% today, which if you look at attendance data nationally from last week, or the week before, I think it was, that I was looking at FFT the other day, it was at 90% nationally. So to be 7.1, now this is me doing nothing more than really trying to emphasize the point of lasting impact because of systematic change, but also just removing that complicated nature. There are systems set up within the school. There's a clear understanding within the school of what the expectation is. And I know there is lots and lots of fantastic practice around this city that is recognised and celebrated, rightly so, on these bases, because these are commonalities that we all share. The issues with attendance is a common thing. And outcomes was our third one, because outcomes in the school were shocking. So those were our three priorities. But we knew that to do anything more than that in that year one phase would be dangerous, because the organisation had nothing before. What we came to learn and understand, though, is that it could be dangerous to do anything more ever. And we're in a real debate at the moment at leadership level and at trust level as to how that continues, and whether or not the three priority, the rule of threes, is something to continue with. I have a very firm perspective on it, and so I think that probably comes through in lots of what I've said so far. So let's just move into what does. Because this is about understanding the school development plan, or understanding an example of a school development plan, and this is a format that was conceived to be really clear, to be really simple, but to be really specific about what we were looking for here as well within this one part of the priority 2 engagement. But what you can see here are really five big things, and those 5 big things being the actions that we wanted to be taken, the outcomes that we expected, the people, the stakeholders, the co-collaborators within this part of the strategy, the people that were leading, the people that were delivering, the people that were quality assuring. And it was always really clear as to where the people function sat within the SDP, or within all of the SDPs. The evidence, which is the larger chunks at the bottom, where are your evidence bases coming from? Sorry, not the larger chunk at the bottom. The evidence across the kind of middle section, the tracking and monitoring and recording, which I'll come on to shortly, and then the steps that you're going to take, and how you want that dream to come to pass. How do we get to being 1.2% above the ever on roll national average status for attendance? So that brings us to the end of section 1. Section 1 being all about understanding the school development plan. I'm just going to come back to the question that came into the chat. Thanks, Sophie, for that point about the EEF thing. And then the other question was, would you mind recapping on how the rule of 3 you referred to aligns with the SDP? I think missed that. I'm not sure that was an anonymous question. I think that probably has come about in the answers, or the kind of exploring of the rest of the detail in that session. If it hasn't, and you just like some further clarity on that point, if you just drop another message into the Q&A. At this point also, I just wanted to welcome and invite, if anybody wants to unmute and ask any questions at this point about that first section before we move into talking about the kind of smart SMART targets and formulating those, and what kind of practical examples there might be. I'll just pause for 10 seconds or so to see if anything pops up, and if not, I'll carry on. Hi, Carol. I can see that you popped your hand up. Have you got a question? If you have, feel free to unmute your so Carol, or do I have to allow you to talk? Maybe I do. Let me try that. Carol, you should, if you've got a question, you should be able to talk now.
I apologize.
Okay. I can hear you. Hello? Okay. Maybe you'd put your hand up by in error. Okay, I'm gonna move on, and Debbie, thanks for clarifying about the point of the rule of three. That's great. Okay, so let's move on, folks. So next section, just talking about SMART goals and formulating them into your SDP as well, or how you might go about it, and then drawing on the examples similar to what I've drawn on previously. So here's a little bit more detail, very similar format to what I showed you on the previous slide as well, but with some quite specific examples. And here I am going to focus on our literacy priority, because it really was a very, very acute need, I think, at the time and in the school. And so here, you'll see things that maybe reference back to when I'd said, we don't be afraid to amend these live documents. We got COVID impacts being referenced in this part of the SDP. It was something that we hadn't expected at the time, so we wanted to make sure that was relevant and relative to that moment. We were continuing to set realistic but ambitious targets for ourselves here as well. I think the key point that I just want to get out of this part and this slide in particular is not only how you set those targets or those actions and those outcomes, and the more specific details within the document itself, but being really clear here as well as to how you are considering those quality assurance frameworks and factors, and also how you are gaining, where you can, the external validation factors. Now, that might be the partnership or partnerships within a mass, the external validation factors, which becoming more and more frequent, positive, and having great impacts within the sector at the moment. But how do you continue to consider those quality assurance factors? Our experience here was that the quality assurance typically came through internal facilitation, but where we felt that there was an area for development, and this comes back to, again, the 16 personalities and understanding your people and skill sets. We would seek to train those internal QA perspectives, which is, I suppose, quite obvious and quite sensible. But from the three priorities that we conceived, and from a couple of slides ago, you'll have seen that literacy has been priority number one for the entire journey that this school has been on. We haven't shifted. It's just been priority number one. It's been focused on every year, and it's been rethought through every year as well, because as certain practices become a staple of the diet that the students experience, and also the parents become familiar with, you can grow it and develop it even further. But the external factors that we wanted to make sure is that for every priority point, we had an external expert as well. And so we were really, fortunate to be using a national literacy expert and former HMI, that we wanted to make sure there was a retainer ready to assign that external validation. And we'll come on to resources and the distribution and use of resources and also finances, because everything within our schools interlinks, doesn't it? And the SDP is only as successful as all of its component parts too, because it is, just come back to that point, it's just a piece of paper with words on, if not. So those external validators we wanted within that retainer that we assigned. They produced validated reports, so that built our evidence base of successes, and then also further work and vulnerabilities, and that formed then what you would probably link to in your own settings, the development stages and the thinking that you would do the year on, year out, and year after to develop these action points. It's probably also quite important to say at this moment in time that in certain priorities, and in the literacy priority in particular, certain actions would stay the same year on year because they hadn't been fully fulfilled, or there was still a little bit of work, or in this SDP's case, COVID impacted as well. But what we then started to do with every action and every strategy and every outcome that we expected, we started to build a basis of how we would track and record and monitor against those actions. Much of the next few slides comes out of a series and a fairly lengthy passage of time, but you'll get a sense of how we started to build the databases for what we wanted to pin those action points and achievable outcomes back to. So here's an example: the spellings. In order to help students read better, to speak better, to write better, we wanted to make sure that they could spell well. And you can see that there's some information here that is actually right up to date. This is still a program that runs within the school. It wasn't, we didn't want to get bogged down in the concepts of, well, kids do spellings when they're in primary school. Why continue that? But we just think it's really important, and that those tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary lists are something that students are accessing frequently. But we needed to make sure that we got capture points for all of this. And we needed to make sure that when we'd said we wanted spellings to be so much better each year, or the way that kids spell, or the average outcomes for kids' spellings to be that much better each year, you have to pin that back to, well, how do you know if it is? And how does everybody within the organisation contribute to that as well? These are big pieces of work that take lots and lots of implementation, decision making, and collaboration to do. But alongside that as well, because what you're looking at here is really the engagement factor, or the engagement of how we wanted staff to understand this. Because as you break down these different component parts, you've got to constantly consider how staff and students are going to interact or understand these different things. This is the staff stuff. You bring people along. You use the ideas that come from your working groups when you're developing. Right, we want to talk about a spelling program. Let's talk about how we might capture that. But let's make it as simple as we can for ourselves, and make sure that this becomes a routine practice that is manageable too. The second part is when you talk about the kids and how you encourage and reward this for the students too. So everything that was born out of the literacy strategy had some kind of tangible outcome or reward for the kids as well. So the LBS 150 challenge, its conceptual idea is that by the end of a 5-year program at Lawswood Boys School, students will have had the opportunity and will have been challenged to have read 150 novels or books that are suggested from a list of 150. And at every waypoint, they will be classified as a gold reader or a platinum reader. And when they do that, and they read that book or they've read that book, they'll also write a review, which we can then check and triangulate spelling outcomes that we're seeing from the way that their tutors record their spelling data. So every part of the component was tied into the triangle or the circle of constant review and constant the implementation process. The final factor really with this was the celebration and encouragement of greater independence at student level as well, and making students understand, or allowing and helping students to understand how critical it is to be that independent person, that if somebody asks you what your reading age is, you know what your reading age is. So our planners were constructed to be tailored purposefully to the boundaries that we were setting, or the constraints that we were setting within our SDP. Every term, the students complete a reading test that gives them or tells them what their average reading age is. They record it in their planner. It is constantly spoken about, and so therefore becomes an embedded system within the school. What does that look like though? And how do you then, because this isn't something necessarily that, we and when we got to our inspection, this is just maybe a side, we knew that inspection probably wasn't going to really want to or even think about getting into this business. What do reading ages look like in the school? I think there has been a slight shift in the way that inspections do and can go now when you start talking about literacy as a whole across a school, particularly where there are great things to celebrate, but also maybe things that need a little bit more work and attention to. But we wanted to be very, very clear as to what this project looked like over time too. Similarly to the slide towards the beginning when I was showing you, what does progress and outcomes look like over time. And remember that minus 44.3 figure that was on slide 3 or 4? Well, there it is. And that's where the start point was. The average reading age gap was that the kids on average were minus 44 months behind their chronological age. And at the end of last year, we were down to minus 6.4 as an average. That includes every student, apart from year 11 students. For those of you that have noticed, the year 11 students we never included within this impact tracking because of, I think at the time, and still continues to be at the time, the importance and relevance on curriculum details that they would get a similar diet from the literacy program, but in terms of impact tracking, it was more focused on the 7 to 10, because if you get it right in year 7 as well, and you get it right in early years, for those early years and primary colleagues, you expect to see that change and that condition have impact in years to come. So yeah, there's that journey, and I suppose when you look at section 1 or priority 1 of our SDP over the last 5 years now, nearly, this is the evidence. This is how all of those component parts, that collaboration, that resource management has factored into, and we use this number, top right hand. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but top right hand side of the screen, 95.7. We use that as that's how much we've reduced the gap in students' chronological age versus their reading age. So a 95.7% reduction from inception of the project back in 17-18 all the way through to the end of last year. which you can see on the far side of the, current in-year at the far side of the slide. You then get into some of the, the other nitty-gritty quantifiable and metrics of this priority. And I would say at this point, colleagues, if anybody ever wants to pick a brain or speak to somebody within the organisation, speak to myself, dare I say it, please reach out. I'd be happy, and it would be a pleasure to share some of those details with you, particularly if, not only SDP wide but also literacy focused, because we do feel and have some quite significant evidence to suggest that there is some good stuff here. I'm sure over the next 2 or 3 years it will become even better, because that's a trend that has been seen. So that brings us to the end of section 2. And again, I'll do similar here. I'll just pause for 10 seconds or so to see if there are any questions that come out of that section, or those last few slides, before moving into the next part.
Hi, Lee. I just wanted to endorse really what you've just said about people visiting. I've popped along to your school maybe a couple of times now.
Yeah.
It's just been, there's such a wealth of information you've given us here. It's absolutely fantastic. It really is. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Thank you. I feel like I've really gone on a journey with you. But just to say, you can see this practice when you go around the school. I was blown away by lots of things I saw and heard from you there. So I think bringing it to life by actually visiting a school does make a big difference, and you can actually see the visioning in practice of everything that Lee's talking about, and the precision that you're showing us today in your strategic planning. You can see it in the impact of the children and how they behave, and the purposefulness of how they're learning in the classroom. So I would encourage people to have a further chat with you or pop along, because I think the richness that you're giving us today is absolutely fantastic.
Thanks, Juliet. Yeah, that's very kind of you to say, and it's always a pleasure when you're able to pop in. But yeah, please do be happy to welcome anybody to come and take a look around and just speak a little bit more about those things that we've learned as well. Because I think one of the key things here, I am going to stop talking about literacy a little bit for the next session. Is you'll always find something in what other people do that you can use yourself, right? Because lots of what I've talked about so far, there is a lot of it that comes out of collaborative thinking, and an expert opinion as well, research. But there's a fair bit of it that has been magpied as well, because you see something, and I'm sure that will be happening with the audience today. There'll be bits that you can kind of go, oh wow, yeah, I'll have that. I'll have a bit of that. And there'll be others that you kind of think, well, that doesn't really fit in with what our priority is. And that's the beauty of collaboration, isn't it? So a little bit less of literacy now. And let's start talking about actionable strategies, prioritising the allocation of resources, and how monitoring happens within, or how monitoring has happened within this journey of developing our plans. So again, rule of 3, folks. Sound like a broken record, maybe, but it's worked for us. It really has worked. Maybe that's just me. I can only manage 3 things at a time. However. So the 3 things here for developing those actionable strategies, the monitoring processes. And I'm not only meaning monitoring in the way that I've just explained, and I am going to go a little bit further into the monitoring processes, because of other metrics and other opportunities that we've taken, because the monitoring is multi-purposeful, or for multi-audiences, isn't it? The monitoring is for you guys and for for yourselves, for us. It's for your governors or your the trustees. But it has to be for the staff and the kids as well. You change the format of how monitoring is shared. Maybe the parents too. So be clear on what needs to be monitored, because not all things need monitoring. We've learned that. We've stopped monitoring certain things, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But make sure you monitor it and do it well. And if you're not sure if you're doing it well, call in an expert, or give your neighbour at the school down the road a call to see and ask for their opinion. Be clear and clarify any and every communication within that process, so everybody understands it. We spend a section of every Wednesday afternoon focused on the SDP, and it might just be one action or one target, but it has a staple point within staff briefing, staff CPD time. Often it links to something that is within the CPD calendar. But those, again, here you've got that interconnection and the triangulation of, well, how do you formulate that strategy to have impacts, where you've got to talk about it all the time, and change it's not necessarily, it was to change language use in the early days of this school recovery program. It was to change the language to be focused on what we were doing, not what we weren't happy about. Okay. But communicating that clearly, and then distribute that leadership as well, because empowering people to take on the opportunities that they want to take on, and to then, as it says there, because it will have inevitable success. The success indicators can be really small, really large as well, but there will be successes. And as soon as the stakeholders, or that distribution of leadership in how you use it, and I'll come back to this in on slide 44 and 45, as it says there too. So the metrics. In year one, we used 15 live metric monitors, or what I call monitors. We used 15 monitors, and we got rid of 5 because they weren't having impacts. And so now we have 10 monitors. We got rid of those 5 over the course of 4 years, but they weren't having the impacts that we wanted. And we were finding that as we've kind of boiled things down, this breaks the rule of 3. I'm sorry about that, but trying to fit all of these monitors into just three things is almost impossible as well. And I'm going to show you an example of 1 or 2 of these things and what I mean by them as well, because these monitors span across the whole SDP. There are bits for literacy. You can see monitor 4 there is the literacy. It monitors the reading ages. There's the spellings, that monitors the spellings of students. The planner audit, we have a planner audit, and that links back to that independent factor. So we check the planners, and there's a monitor for that. So when I use the word monitor, you understand that I'm talking about a tracker. Maybe use the word tracker instead. The prism records everything to do with behaviours and attitudes. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Course command. This was something that we developed in year 2, and this was all about, well, how well do our students command the curriculum that they're being taught? How well is our intent, or are our intent statements being completed, or how well can students talk about? But what evidence is there? A course command monitor was conceived, and it's really useful. It really does gets even more useful when you move to assessment points as well, because you can see the relationship between assessment achievements and also, well, what was the commands that student or that group of students had of that concept or that part of the curriculum at the time. Some really creative and wide-reaching principles within that too. So here's an example of what I mean by a monitor or a prism, and they are, folks, they are spreadsheets. typically, but they're all cloud-based. Everything is on the cloud. Everything is live. There is ownership for everybody to see everything. So every member of staff, doesn't matter what your position is in the school, you have access to see this. Certain members of staff engage with it in a particular way because they have a responsibility or they've got a performance objective to contribute to it. But here's a monitor that's used for those for the prism. It looks at everything, behaviours and attitudes. Here's a monitor that we use for detention tracking, and it looks at the what I hope you will start to see here is you've got different phases of the way that these monitors are used, or different kind of ways in which these monitors are used. And there are three, rule of three. Rule of three, the things that we do use them for. We use them to record, we use them to analyse, and then we use them to present. And so the recording factor is clear. The analytics of this, a lot of it is to do with things like, well, how do our detentions look at the moment? And how do they look compared to previous half terms? And what's the decrease or increase in percentage of detentions? And how does that factor against a shorter or a longer half term? So you've got that record phase. The prism is a great example of that, although the detention monitor is also equally good at that. But it gets deeper into the analysis there, the analysis phases. And then you've got the present. And this is where we start to really consider how the actions and outcomes from the SDP translate for multi-audiences, because this type of graphical analysis, and you can link it to anything and everything within the organization, I suppose, but this type of graphical analysis really just allows for you to, well, are we on the right path here? And this is some graphical analysis from detention. So it's just a real quick touchstone, isn't it? Are we on the right path? Are our detentions decreasing from where they have been? Yes, they are. How much? How far? What else can we do? How else do we need to? The students need to see this at the moment, because there's no harm in showing students this. It's their detentions. So then you ask the question, well, is this linking back to what we'd set out to do? And you triangulate back to what was the SDP's intent and what was this section's intent in particular for behaviour and attitudes, or engagement as it was in the examples that I've shown you before. I'm going to stop talking about the processes that we're currently using and talk a little bit now more about how we used, or how we associated our thinking to what is most important to put into the SDP as well. Because although I've shared some examples of what our actions and what our outcomes and what our strategies and what our metrics are, I think it's just really good to pin back to a little bit of theory and research and the strategies that have underpinned all of this decision making. I've talked about the EEF, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment as well. And one of the first things that we look at alongside the implementation strategy guidance is just to consider the Eisenhower time matrix, and typically at the end of half term 5, start of half term 6, the subgroups of leaders within the school, whether that be leadership team, directors of learning, faculty leads, leaders of subjects, leaders of pastoral matters, and then your wider teacher groups, start to identify what are their most important, urgent or non-urgent items from the SDP, and then going forward for the SDP into next year as well. And this is where we really get to the nub of, we'll get rid of what isn't having impact and doesn't need to be focused on at the moment. When I talk to you about having 15 monitors and we've now only got 10. That's because at the time, 5 of them just went into delete on the time matrix. They're not important, they're not urgent. And also then the final factor was they're not having any impact. And so if they're not having any impact, you just whip them out, because inevitably they're creating work for somebody within the organization, and that can then alleviate and contribute towards your people strategy and the well-being of your people in your organization. So the Eisenhower time matrix is a critical one and a useful one to use. And if you've not used it before, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have. It's actually quite a good cleansing exercise as well, to do with groups of people, you know, list of names of things or titles of things on pieces of paper, pop them into what box you think they should be in. And then secondary to that is just being clear and understanding that you can do even more when you foster that culture of flexibility, and understanding that in all of your decision making, the agility that is provided to be bold, but to delete things when they need to be or should be deleted, to encourage those continuous improvements through feedback loops. And our staff days, there will always be a focus on a review of the SDP to get staff voice, to get a complete picture of how is the SDP being applied, what are the opinions of certain factors of the SDP, what are the confidence intervals of the way that the SDP is being delivered. And directors of learning, the heads of faculty, would typically lead those parts of the conversation. So it really pins back down into what matters most at that right time, and being really bold and courageous to say, well, we need to leave that, or we need to amend that part of the SDP. Well, we'll just leave it there. Because the other thing here, folks, as well, I think it's important. If you just leave things there and they don't get anything, no work gets done on them, you've got no evidence. You've got no evidence to say that, well, this is what we did and this is how we did it. Just get rid of it. There's the third point on this slide on the right hand side is this point about the Kaizen philosophy, and this is interesting. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's actually really, really interesting to see the parallels between the Kaizen philosophy, which was a Japanese originating philosophy, I understand, and the EEF strategy, which I'll come on to in a moment. But this point about incremental changes that improve processes over time, what we're talking about, and the language that I've been frequent in using within the school, is just consider a 1% increase. What does it look like if you just turn it up by 1%? What does attendance look like if you just turn it up by 1%? And what do you need to get to that 1%? And then how does the SDP facilitate that? How do the resources and the resource management within the organisation facilitate it? Just 1%. And if you do that with every component part systematically over a period of time, and I'm talking about a 5-year journey here, the results are transformational. You know, the outcomes are transformational, and it's all been based on that. Just turn it up. You just turn it up a little bit at a time. Don't try and be too ambitious. I made reference to the point about introducing an elite sports academy in year 1. It's too much. That's 10%, 20% shift. It was just too much. So there's that Kaizen. I mean, the colours are quite similar for one reason, but look, the comparisons between that, and if I won't stay on this slide too long, but come back to it on the recording and just look at the similar uses of languages here as well. I'm actually not too sure if the Kaizen philosophy influenced the EEF. It wouldn't surprise me if it did, but I'm not too sure. It's just from the thinking or the experiences of using things like this that I make that reference of the two together. So let's move on a little bit to resource management, and just, I think, without wanting to tell anybody anything they don't know, everything that comes out of our SDPs linked to what we call our IPT, which is our integrated planning tool. But the Department for Education referenced the ICFP, which is the integrated curriculum and financial planning tool or toolkit. There's a link on this slide if you've not heard of it before. It's actually really useful. We have amended and created our own, but this is where you can start to be really specific about how much does your SDP need within these types of integrated planning tools to be successful and to deliver what you want and dream for it to deliver. The items that are on the DfE's website, there's one for primary, there's one for secondary, there's one for SEN school. So they present these. They're fairly new, I think. Or these toolkits are fairly new. However, as it says there on the last paragraph on the left-hand side, the concepts of linking curriculum to financial planning isn't new. You know, every school that has been successful has typically done it in some way, shape, or form. You remember me talking about a deficit that was inherited here. The key platform to move that deficit out of the school was by using a really systematic approach to integrated planning and linking then that to the SDP as well. So I think that's just an example of what one of the primary model looks like. So they're well guided. You do need to take a little bit of time for. It'd be interesting to know if anybody's used those as well. Just as I'm talking through, so if people have, just pop in a comment in or in the Q&A to say yeah we've used it or no. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to have a look at it. Depending on where you are within your leadership journey as well. These are great things to be aware of if you're developing in your leadership practice. But the process and platform of the ICPF is a good one. And what I think then I am going to link back to my local context here, because when that is well planned and well successful,
you know, they've every day.
Hello? Oh, okay. When it is well planned and well successful, or successful, sorry, you can be really sure of your cost efficiency. And there's just some examples here that pull out as the things that we've managed to do because of the way that we've integrated our planning from the SDP and prioritized resources, I think would be the right way to phrase this now. So we've been able to do things like increase our what we call literacy operatives in the school. So the people that work outside of curriculum time with students to focus on their reading. We've spent more money than what we probably would have ever expected to on resource in a library, because the integrated planning facility has allowed us to be really specific, because it's driven by what do you need. And when your SDP drives what you need to be able to deliver that plan, you are then in a position where you can apportion those funds differently. We do now have a sports academy, and the climbing wall is an example of how we've been able to move to a point of, okay, well, we want to enrich that academy with certain things. The climbing wall is one of them. It was a great opportunity to take and to do that as well. And carrying on with that process of how an integrated planning tool that looks at the curriculum, the SDP's focus, the needs that are generated from those dreams and hopes of that planning, you then can do things that are unique to the setting and the environment. So a condition of the school now is that we every term we have a reading week where the entire curriculum stops, and the whole school, as it says there, drop out of the curriculum and they read. Every student in a year group specific read a particular book, and they read that book from front cover to back cover, and along the way they speak to authors about the book that they are reading, or they complete some performance activity that's relative to that book, and as you can see at the bottom there with those happy faces, they get treated and rewarded at reading cafes as well whilst they're doing it. But that's a unique practice that is born out of the SDP because of the focus that was drawn to that, and he's continued to continually drawn to it within the development plan, but also because of the resource that we have been able to apportion to that part of the experience for the students. Promote it until you can't promote it anymore, and promote everything that you do through every outfit and outlets that you can. So raise the profile. And one thing that we've done in terms of making sure that our resource management is as well used as it can be is we've just branded and created an identity as a school that, you know, I talked about uniform earlier on and the decision-making processes of using the EFF strategy just to change something like a tie. It's the image that is created, the understanding that students have, the students and the community feel as one and together, and they have an identity. So that's come to the end of section 3 now. We were going to take a quick break, but I'm going to carry on into the final couple of sections of the presentation. We're on just past 3, so 55 minutes until the end of the scheduled time. If there are any questions at this moment in time that anybody wants to pop in into the chat, then please do so. I'll just wait a couple of seconds to see if there is anything, and if not, I'm going to move on to tools and mechanisms next. About, you know, how have we made sure that we've shared the progress of our SDPs over time. Okay, so let's move on. So tools and mechanisms for the delivery of an SDP, or our SDP, as a live example. Keep it simple, or as simple as you can, because, you know, although there are three priorities within the examples that I've shown you, there's further component parts to it. Link it back to evidence and share the progress frequently to ensure that all stakeholders have a clear understanding. And here's a practical example of what I mean. And I call it the delivery matrix. This is one from a few years ago now. But what this does, it just provides a real simple overview as to how the SDP is being delivered. And so the questions that might come from this, or maybe the less obvious thing is the colours. So green means that part of the SDP is complete. So A1A, after 2 weeks, it was completed because it was what we would call a fairly simple target, but an important target to me. Amber means that that it's work in progress, and then blue, it's an undeveloped part of the SDP. The great thing about this is that similarly to all of the other monitors within the school, the person that is the lead for that part of the SDP, they complete this on a weekly basis. So they're just constantly updating it. Well, where is the evidence? Is there evidence to support that is a completed target? Is that evidence qualified by an external quality assurance factor, or is it qualified by an internal quality assurance factor? What this also does, it gives a real good visual understanding for stakeholders such as governors and trustees, so they can link back to, which we know is important, because it's important that when governors and trustees have conversations with inspectors, they want to know that they understand what's going on in the school and the philosophical reasons why the school does things, but also how they govern the school and the leaders within the school as well. When you have an inclusive understanding of what your priorities are and how well you're progressing towards those priorities, what the challenges have been, what the barriers maybe are at the moment to complete those priorities. So this kind of overview delivery matrix is a really key and critical part of us keeping a close eye on the SDP, because you spend a lot of time. I've explored with you. You spend a lot of time and invest a lot of energy into conceiving these documents, and so therefore you want to make you want, and the community have contributed to it as well. So you want to know together that, well, we're having the impacts that we want it, or it's having the impacts that we want it to have. Furthermore to that, we break our school down into what we call a management and delivery team, so an MDT, and their focus typically is split into the priorities. So down the left-hand side, you can see the priorities that link back to the SDP. Basically, every document, every conceived document or metric in some shape, way, or form links back to terminology or language that's used within the SDP. Everything. So the school development plan becomes the document that cascades language, metric, action into every other component part of the school as it needs to operate. So those manage and delivery team operatives, leaders, middle leaders, are really clear in their targets, their success indicators, their appraisal points, and then also the academic delivery team is one component part of the management and delivery team, and then the pastoral support team is the second component of the management and delivery team. So two teams come out of the whole management structure: pastoral and academic focus, and those components or those teams will operate collectively, chaired by what you can see, two different chairs for each group, and focus then specifically on how that SDP focus point at the time is being delivered, or monitored in particular. So that covers some of the details about delivery matrices, the tools and mechanisms. Are there any questions at that point about the matrix that I showed you a minute ago, or what that might mean for you in your setting, maybe, and if not right now, if there's anything that you think of that you want to come back to, and contact me individually, that's, again, I'd be very happy to have a conversation in the coming days or future as well. If not, I'm going to move to what I've classified or called the final section of the presentation today, which is moving into the engagement factors with other stakeholders. So let me just skip to that. Yeah, okay. So the final section before going into any final question and answers, and just sharing the response mechanisms for feeding back from this session as well. Looking and thinking about just noticed a comment come in. I'm just going to pause and come to that first of all. So thanks for that, Debbie. Yeah. That's I think that's it's a really fair point. You know, the management of recording things weekly, like I've shown you here. If I just skip back to, I had a feeling that might come up actually as a question or a point. Yeah, so managing the input of, I don't know what you would, I think in its simplest form, turning a cell on a spreadsheet or a box on a piece of paper, a particular color, whether or not that is manageable on a weekly perspective. This example goes back a couple of years now, Debbie, and we were still quite deep in the recovery stage here, and COVID had caused us a problem or two as well. And I was always really conscious of, you know, well, what did what might be the straw that breaks the camel's back with this type of monitoring. And it was a really important thing for us to be really open and transparent with the staff as well, because it is a lot. And you have to consider, well, how much monitoring, how much do we want people to do? I think that this is something that becomes really important locally in the context of, you know, what you manage and what you work with. I completely understand and get schools go through periods and phases, and it's important that when a phase is complete, that there is a shift in the way that operation and evaluation is completed. Standards always need to probably be quite similar, because otherwise, or expectations, because otherwise standards can start to slip. I think the point you're making there is half-termly feasible. Yeah, because it's feasible if that feels right for the organisation and that context. There might be different ways as well that you record this type of detail. It might be that you don't do it in this way, but you just do it by the nature of minutes of meetings, and therefore, because minutes of meetings are quite standard, it's not something extra. Minutes of meetings aren't normally something extra, and it's captured within that. You know, you have actions that come out of minute, etc. So this came out of a collaborative discussion as well across all levels of the school. You know, how are we going to track this? How are we going to monitor it? What do we want? How are we going to involve ourselves? Hopefully that gets to answer that question, Debbie. And thanks very much for your point there and your question as it was. If there isn't anything else on that, I'll move back to the final section. Okay, so and this really wraps up the webinar now, folks. Just talking a little bit in a little bit more about strategies for involving teachers, and I was really toying with whether this should be at the start of the presentation or at the end, but I thought it was really useful to provide you with, you know, a complete picture and some of the tools, some of the developed thinking and the ideas that we've used here, and then actually come back to the start again to really qualify and quantify all of those things that you've listened to and heard from me this afternoon. So, second book recommendation, and I won't go into too much detail about heroic growth model, but this was a really, I found this this book. I read it about 10 years ago, and always kept it in the back of my mind as to well, what does growth need in a school environment? How do you bring people into what typically is the conceived kind of perspective and idea of a key leader? How do you bring people along with you? This book is great at identifying some of the ways that that heroic growth. It's a bit of an unusual word, I suppose, heroic growth. But it's how do we bring people along with us? So, great book. Take a moment to read it if you can. What do we mean by heroic growth? Let's let this illustration run a few times and see if it just sinks in. It's nothing new, I don't think. Nothing that you probably won't have thought about or have listened to or have, you know, understood in, you know, your leadership operations before. But you start by yourself. You start with you bring people with you in that growth phase. You take some time to reflect. You bring a few more people with you, so your component parts get bigger. You reflect again, and by the end of, you know, a number of stages, you've got a majority the reason for talking about heroic growth is because in the first stages of this recovery program here, there wasn't a majority. There was a minority of like-minded, aspirational, adventurous, creative thinking people that hadn't considered what their personality types were, or how they worked together as a team, or how you got the best out of people. And having read and thought about this concept of heroic growth, bring people with you, don't give them false hope or false promise, but just share a vision, share a concept, because some people won't ever subscribe to it either, and you have to be conscious of that, I think. But this concept really does impact on what can be achieved within a school development plan too. So the concept of the heroic growth model was something that sat, and when I said I'm draw back to the early stages after going through all of that process with you, it drew me back to thinking really clearly and specifically about how do you build the majority. You want people to come with you, you want it to be collaborative, which it has been at every opportunity and at every point of thinking more widely. But at some point you can't do it all on your own. And you have to have stakeholders that are invested in the idea, the concept, that you present information to them. Look, I'm presenting information. Students can't read well enough. We've got to address it. Students are not here enough. We've got to address it. And the outcomes are terrible. So we've got to address it. These are the ways that I want to address it with you. And I want you to be a co-collaborator and a joint architect, all the rest of it. And that's how you build that heroic growth. I'm aware that there'll be, delegates on the call this afternoon and also listening post the recording of this that will see that there are moments within either their leadership journey or also moments to come that this is a principle that could be useful in, understanding and just really bringing out as a transparent factor too. About half an hour ago, 45 minutes ago, I talked about laminated SDP on every wall in an office. And some of you in here and some of you watching might have been at the BET conference 2 years ago and listened to Mark Finnings, or you might have listened to him previously. Mark Finnings has got no stake to having school development planning, I don't think. His expertise and quite frankly, captivating delivery is about restorative practice. But he used a term which I have never forgotten since listening to him, and it struck a chord at the time. And his term was, "Is your policy lived or laminated?" He didn't say or both, because I've added that in, and I think it's important that it is both, because I said to you 45 minutes ago, I expect the SDP to be on every office or workroom wall. Now, it's not expected to be there to nothing to be done with it. It's expected to be there to be lived and for it to be a focus point. And for when somebody's taken a sip of their coffee and they're about to have a conversation with another colleague about something that's related to the SDP, it's there. It's just there as a tool. It's not there to be anything more or anything less. And if you've never watched or listened to Mark Finnings talk, he's got loads of stuff on his YouTube as well. He's a great presenter, captivating speaker, and if you're interested in restorative practice as well, he's a really useful speaker to listen to about that. And he does talk about culture, transforming schools, and I suppose, look, we are talking about transforming cultures here today with an SDP. It is in essence transforming an organisation. The journey that I've and the picture that I painted, I think, for this afternoon is about that transformation. But I think it has to be both. Everything everything. We do a lot of laminating, don't we, in schools? We do a lot of things to sometimes not really understand the reason why we do them as well, because it just feels right, or it is the right thing to do. We know it's the right thing to do, but living something that is laminated, I think, is an important thing. And I just wanted to draw back to that point that I said earlier today, when about asking for the SDP to be on every office wall, because I know the response to that sometimes can be, well, what for? What would you do that for? What's the purpose of it? Whilst we're still in the details about stakeholder engagement, let me just flick back to the priority number 1 of ours. Over time, we developed student oracy factors. Students now create a podcast every I think it's every couple of weeks. The podcast goes out, and that podcast they talk about their reading experiences. Those podcasts are played in the school, so kids get to listen to them at different times throughout the day. They're played within the refectory during quieter social times, so kids can hear other kids talking and being asked questions about the things that they're reading. That, folks, as you will know, in turn affects behaviours and attitudes. It affects engagement. It affects outcomes. That all of those component parts linking together. How do you make sure that the stakeholders don't only feel involved, but that stakeholder participation is contributing to the intent and the outcome? We work really closely with community links and partnerships with charitable trusts to bring in additional resources for the benefit of the students' reading programs, and also the parental engagement. And I know that of the primary colleagues that are on and speaking as a dad with 2 kids still in primary school, this is something that primary schools just do so well. The concept of bringing parents in and working with and sitting next to their sons and daughters and with the teachers, and it's just a concept that has been applied as the strategy has developed here at Lordswood too. So just 1 or 2 final examples of how stakeholder engagement continues to be an important, relevant, and an influential factor within the SDP. And finally, a little bit cheesy, I suppose, but the not leaving any change that you make within your settings, within your leadership decision making to chance. Use the component parts and understand the people that you work with, and let them understand you as well, to get the very best out of your SDP journeys. I hope that I know that we're at 3:30. It was scheduled to last until 4 o'clock, although I did skip out the break and some of the engagement activities. I've just noticed that there's a question popped up into the chat. So just before I open up any further for questions and closing remarks, Juliet, Claire, I'm just going to call on you. Okay to read out these questions, or would you rather me not? What's the protocol? Is that okay?
Sorry, Lee, I was just trying to get my video to work. Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely fine. We had another one from Sophie, didn't we? Which is just more than happy for you to read them out. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you, Sophie, just for popping that in, and I appreciate it. So Sophie said, not a question, just a thought to share. Our leadership team each have a SIP focus, and it's on their wall with tons of annotations, and it's really picked apart. SIP is interlinked with staff meetings. I mean, I thanks for sharing that, Sophie. Isn't it great when they're just lived? You know, they really are. I think, Juliet, you probably remember Mark speaking at that at the conference. And it was that moment where you kind of go, you listen, you hear certain things, you go, wait a minute, yeah, that's really what we're after here. You know, when collaboration is fully lived and it's not just something that's stuck up. I'd love to see that, Sophie. I bet it's a really interesting read when you look at all of the annotations that are put on it. But interlinking it with the staff meetings, the CPD, you know, how do you carve up the time within CPD opportunities, staff days, etc., to refocus back on those things. So, any other questions that anybody has? Please feel free to pop them into the chat at the moment. If there aren't any further questions or any consolidated thoughts or thinking or share points, I'd be really, really grateful if you could use the QR code that's on the screen at the moment just to help give some feedback on the session this afternoon. I know Beth would be really keen to get feedback, as well as the leadership webinar series continues, and gets, you know, information as to what do the leaders in the city want to hear about going further forward as well. So, colleagues that are still with us, thank you very much for listening. Beth, Juliet, Claire, thank you very much for inviting me and having me here with you this afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about our journey, some of the critical factors that have been involved along the way. And I would be absolutely delighted to have any further conversations beyond this point with anybody that's that just wants to pick up the phone and give me a chat, have a chat. My email address and contact details are on our school website. I know I haven't put it on this slide, so if you go to Lords of Boys School or Central Academies Trust, you'll find my contact details on the website. Debbie, thank you very much for that lovely comments. That's lovely to hear and lovely to know. I think the final thing that I would say, just before handing back over to Juliet as well, I am really not precious about any of this work. If there's something that you want to take, there's something you want a file of, there's something you want a PDF of, just ask, folks. Our business is difficult enough at times, and where we can collaborate by not being precious about intellectual copyright, etc. I completely am willing and wanting to share things with you. So thank you so much, everybody, and over to you, Juliet.
I just have to say a huge thank you, Lee. I mean, I'm absolutely overwhelmed by your webinar this afternoon. There's so much work, and more than that, it's the generosity of spirit with which you shared that I've absolutely loved. I completely concur with Debbie. I've absolutely loved listening to it this afternoon. You know, when you're on webinars, there's the temptation, isn't it, to go off and do some jobs and come back, kind of thing. But I can tell you, I've been with you the whole way through. It's really inspired me. When we started these leadership webinars, people were saying, "Oh, you know, will people want to come and share?" But you've just encapsulated in what you said there how much richer our city will be with a generosity of spirit, as you've just described. And I hope Sophie gets in touch and invites you over to look at her working wall of SIPness. And same with Debbie and all the people on the call. I think these ones who have stuck with from beginning to end. I think some people have probably gone for afternoon duty. But I know everybody will have benefited hugely. So thank you so much. It really is much appreciated. And I think it paves the way for so many more of these things that we should be doing, sharing with each other. We've got all the answers within our schools. We just need to share them.
Completely.
Fantastically. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you again. Thanks, folks.
No worries. See you all soon. Take care. Do the feedback. Thanks, Lee.